Thank you, Łukasz. Thank you, everybody. Revolutions don't get to choose their symbols. When we think of the French Revolution, we think about the taking of the Bastille. They actually have a national day to commemorate it. The Bastille was empty of political prisoners when it was taken. Okay, they did liberate Count de Sade, but still, it wasn't the big event of the French Revolution. It was a nasty piece of real estate in downtown Paris, relatively easy to take because undefended, became the symbol of something when so many other things were more important. When we think of the October Revolution, we of course think of the storming of the Winter Palace, thanks to Cecilie Eisenstein's excellent cinematography. Having said that, it was militarily unimportant, politically deserted, and if it were not for Eisenstein, we'd be probably thinking of another symbol. Same applies to the fall of the wall. First of all, it has a great sound, the fall of the wall. Second, you can't beat in terms of sheer dramatism of photography the picture of people with their bare hands tearing down the wall. When the Germans were tearing down that wall, we had a semi-democratic parliament in operation for a couple of months. I believe you call that in Swedish a Polska Riksdag. And in Hebrew, balagan. I always wonder why the Israelis think that balagan is a Hebrew word. I come from where it was invented and creatively developed. And in that balagan that started the process of the downfall of communism and of the Soviet Empire, quite a few activists were Polish Jews. The names of Adam Michnik, Marek Edelman, Bronisław Geremek come to mind. And as the marvelous news from Poland started seeping out, they had democratic elections, they moved into free entrepreneurship, they're moving forward, they're making progress. Poland is a success story. Among that weird news, information started filtering that they even have Jews there. Like Jewish Jews, or at least Jews doing Jewish things. And it sounded good Jewish news from Poland. It sounded like the ultimate oxymoron, right? I mean, Jewish news from Poland throughout the 20th century had been more or less uniformly bad. And suddenly there was this Jewish something going on. Different media reports used different words, a Jewish revitalization, a Jewish rebirth, a Jewish renaissance. There obviously was a Jewish re-something going on. And there was a Jewish re-something going on. The interesting thing was trying to nail down the something, trying to discover what it was about, because it largely shapes the Jewish community in Poland today, which in itself wouldn't be terribly important. We're a small community, but it also seems to address some more fundamental issues regarding Jewish continuity and, in fact, who we are, at least who we think we are. By the 70s, the consensus was that Judaism in Poland is over. The last great emigration was 68, 69, 70. Some of the members of that emigration are here in the room. And after that, it really, really seemed to be over. And for some 10 years, it really was. But as a Warsaw joke has it, each time the last Jew of Poland leaves Poland, some 200 of his next of kin and closest friends go to see him off. And then the story continues. And in fact, the story did continue with a movement of Poles of Jewish origin, for lack of a better term, who in the late 70s, started to try to figure out where they came from and what, if anything, that means. Now, it really is important at this point to try to dissect it almost surgically, because there were three things happening more or less at the same time in the late 70s, and they continue to this very day, and I think they should be kept separate. One is a rebirth of interest for things Jewish in wider Polish society. It was dismissed as a fad when it started in the late 70s. Well, fads don't go on for 40 years. It's still continuing. It's at times mawkish and sentimental, or even commercialized, as in the case of Kazimierz. But there's much more to it. When it started happening, it was very largely a moral movement. A movement which was part of a wider movement of Polish society against the lies we were brought up on and taught to repeat. One of those lies was that there were no Jews, or if they were, they're unimportant, and in any way Polish-Jewish relations were wonderful. And when young non-Jewish Poles started discovering that this is not necessarily true, they bit into it for the same reasons that young people always bite into things they discover are lies. And frankly, it's psychologically very understandable. You could say fuck at your parents' dinner table and maybe somebody would say mind your manners. But you say Jew and the conversation drops dead. Because everybody is uneasy with the subject. The communists are uneasy with it because they have both been accused of being Jewish in essence, but also they have used anti-Semitism in practice. One way or the other, just prefer it not to be discussed. Same is true of the anti-communists. I mean, until '68, being anti-communist was simple. You were anti-communist because you were anti-Semitic, or if you were anti-Semitic, you were anti-communist, because communism was Jewish, right? But if the communists become anti-Semitic, then you have a problem. You actually have to choose. Because if you continue being anti-Semitic, well, you're not as anti-communist as you thought you are. I remember an old anti-Semite telling me, look, the Reds can ruin anything. I mean, a good thing like anti-Semitism, they took it and they ruined it. It's true, communists ruined the reputation of anti-Semitism. So communists were uncomfortable with Jews, anti-communists were uncomfortable with Jews, Catholics were uncomfortable with Jews. The Polish Church had a long history of anti-Semitism, but then Vatican II was still a relatively fresh thing, and it seemed that there's new Catholic thinking, and then John Paul II comes along. There were good reasons to say, for conversation to drop dead when the word Jew was uttered. And young people took to it with a passion. Young Catholics used it to finally bring Vatican II home. The Polish Church wasn't very enthusiastic about Vatican II, which I can understand. When you're a besieged fortress, the last thing you want to do is to critically re-examine the foundations, right? But a younger generation of Catholics rammed it home. And then there was the discovery of this huge black hole, this loss that Alexa was telling us about. And with it came the realization that you can't really understand Poland if you don't factor in the Jews. That remains to this very day a very important driving force for the non-Jewish Polish interest in things Jewish, which is a very important phenomenon, except it's not Jewish. It's Poland sorting itself out. And of course, we are part of that sorting out. But the process is not one which defines Jewish identity or promotes Jewish culture or even strengthens Jewish communities. It's a very welcome thing. It's a very helpful thing. It just isn't Jewish. And of course, parallel with that, you had a resurgence of anti-Semitism, because this is one of the unavoidable consequences of freedom. If we fight for freedom, we fight for everybody's freedom, including the master's freedom. Otherwise, it's not freedom, right? The full extent of it was revealed only after '89, and only after '89, my non-Jewish Polish friends who earlier would tell me that they understand that I'm very sensitive about anti-Semitism, but frankly, I'm exaggerating the whole thing. I mean, there is no anti-Semitism. They've never encountered it in their lives. Well, they didn't. They weren't Jewish. After '89, it was out on the streets. It was in Parliament. It was in the media. Nobody could deny it's there. And to this very day, anti-Semitism remains the focal point of Jewish reflection on Poland, and it is a very important aspect. But just like philo-Semitism, it's not Jewish. It's not about us. And between those twin factors of philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism, and the balance between them, of course, shifts, and right now we're going through a pretty nasty time, there remain the Jews. Okay, if I have to choose between anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism, I'll take philo-Semitism, but frankly, I prefer everybody to leave me alone. And let me try to sort myself out. Let us try to sort ourselves out, which is what we're trying to do, caught in this rather extraordinary historical set of circumstances surrounding the fall of communism and the eruption of freedom. And when I say we, I mean the generation of Polish Jews who were born after the war, raised under communism, and essentially raised Polish. If somebody had a strong Jewish identity, they eventually left Poland. Religious Jews moved eventually elsewhere, if for no other reason than for practical reasons. I mean, getting kosher food and finding kosher son-in-law or daughter-in-law, or not having to worry if there will be a minyan in shul. Those things eventually wear you down, and you just move somewhere where this is not an issue. The same was largely true of Polish Zionists. With the exception of the years 49 to 56, Aliyah was always possible from Poland. Okay, there was red tape, there was some harassment, whatever, but you could move and take some luggage with you. It wasn't the way it was in Russia, where the shortest way to Jerusalem was through Siberia, and then wait a few years. Therefore, Polish Zionists did not leave behind the heroic legend that Russian refuseniks did, right? They just left. So the two main poles of Jewish identity formation, the religious and the Zionist, were simply not there. So those who were attracted to one or the other eventually left. Those who remained were either those who were continuing a pre-war tradition of Jewish left-wing political radicalism and were hoping that communist Poland will, as Marxism had promised, solve the Jewish problem by solving the existence of the Jews, but in a kind of step-by-step way, or those who simply believe they're Polish. And both groups were surprised in '68, if not earlier, to discover that both dreams were simply not true. And they left. So those who stayed behind were those who were raised Polish, very often in mixed marriages, almost exclusively without attaching any importance to the fact that they're Jewish, often even ignoring that, because their parents or the grandparents had done the maskirovka, their cover-up, well enough for them not even to know that they have an identity they might want to worry about. In the case of my family, it was, we were so assimilated that we didn't even bother denying we're Jewish. It was that unimportant. And these were the people who were suddenly found themselves with the job of trying to rebuild Jewish life in Poland after '89. We were, of course, not the only Jews in Poland. There were two main Jewish organizations. There was the lay, secular, Yiddishist, and initially militantly left-wing Jewish Sociocultural Association, and there was the Jewish Religious Union, both of them heavily compromised under communism. And therefore, even if much more representative of what was left of the Jewish population, because at that time you couldn't even speak of a Jewish community, if much more representative of what was left of the Jewish population, they were not the spokespersons. We had the political credentials, having gone through the underground, being part of the Solidarity movement, being the winners, so everybody's a surprise. Nobody really expected that. So we became the public face of Polish Jewry, and we knew next to nothing about being Jewish. However, there seemed to be something of a shortcut. When the Jewish Flying University started in the late 70s, it was a group of around 60 people in Warsaw, very similar background, Polish intelligentsia, of Jewish origin or not. In the beginning it was totally irrelevant. We're simply interested in things Jewish and not solving our personal issues. And then, with the passage of time, it turned out that practically all of the people who were most active in setting up the Jewish Flying University and having it operate eventually became either religious or made aliyah. Because these were the two items on the menu that were readily available. We didn't have enough Jews to have a Jewish street which could give us a voice. We had to reach out for already existing models. Not that we did it consciously, of course, but that was the net result. And those of us who stayed behind and became religious opted for the Orthodox version of, because it seemed the most evident, most genuine, most guaranteed, truly Jewish way of being. What we absolutely failed to realize is that on the one hand, we were fulfilling an expectation of at least a segment of Polish non-Jewish civil society that wanted its Jews the proper way, the way the Jews look, act, behave, and therefore clearly are a different kind of bird than Poles. Jews should be Orthodox, keep kosher, keep quiet. And on the other hand, we actually scared many of the Jews who stayed behind in the Sociocultural Association because we were exactly the thing that their parents or grandparents had rebelled against. And on top of that, we were the public face of Polish Jewry, and we were the victors of historical transformation. Speak of a mess. We were clueless. We really had no idea that the kind of individual choices we're making have a sociological impact and a historical background. We didn't carry that historical knowledge. And for quite a few of the Jews who stayed, we didn't carry authenticity either. I mean, when I started going to shul, which was in the early 80s, I was the youngest congregant by 2 generations, and the elderly gentleman, after some time finally deigning to notice that I'm there, asked me, "Redest du Yiddish? Nicht? Und du bist Yid?" That was the end of it. Okay, we picked up the conversation a couple of years later when I was still around, and they couldn't avoid the fact that I was there. But then they told me that I should get the hell out of here and go to Israel. They need me in the army. If I can't be Jewish the Yiddish way, at least I should be Jewish the Israeli way and stop bothering them. And frankly, I understand that very well. When you were 70 and have lived those 70 years as a Jew in Poland, the last thing you wanted was more trouble. And we obviously were trouble with our solidarity connections, our Polishness, All that was sure to make trouble, and we did. We know that from archives that were opened after '89, that the authorities of the religious congregations had a great deal of explaining to do to the supervisor from the secret police about why are there young Jews in shul. The deal was no more young Jews and we'll leave you alone. We weren't terribly convincing, say, to Marek Edelman either. We proudly invited him to one of our first Jewish Flying University meetings, and he looked at us and said, okay, you're literary fiction. You've invented yourselves. You're not Jewish, the Jews are dead. Don't waste my time. Now, Marek never really retracted those words, but he stopped telling us we're literary fictions of 20 years later, which is as close as he ever came to a retraction of anything. Marek was stubborn in his beliefs. The irony of it all, of course, is that we were not only unrepresentative of the Jewish population as it existed in Poland at the time of transformation, but we were unrepresentative squared of the history of Polish Jewry. We were, if anything, the continuation of the 10 to 15% of Poland's pre-war Jewish population that assimilated sufficiently to consider themselves Polish, not that anybody else thought them as Polish. To the Poles, they remained Jews. To the Jews, they were traitors. They were numerous enough to create a microcosm of their own civil society, but it wouldn't occur to them that they are representatives of Poland's Jewry. And do we, their children or grandchildren, now wear? We also did not realize that what to us was the logical solution to the lack of Jewish identities and models, to other Jews was a threat. Now, our choice of religiousness was not opportunistic. It wasn't political. We made this itinerary, each of us in a different way, for spiritual reasons, for moral reasons. We got there, we knew why we got there. But to so many of the other Jews, it seemed like a direct threat. And this included some Israelis who, after '89, moved back to Poland from Israel because already then they were feeling oppressed by the growing presence of the religious in Israeli political life. And they reach Warsaw and they find horror. The enemy is already there. The beards are there. One very brilliant Israeli woman who now teaches Jewish studies at Warsaw University published a broachy denunciation of us in Gazeta Wyborcza, the biggest Polish daily, saying that we are actually fooling people. We're telling people that Judaism is about Torah and Tanakh and Kashrut and Mitzvot. No, it's Freud, it's Einstein, it's Kafka, it's everything but. And eventually a public debate was organized between her and me at the club of the Jewish Sociocultural Association, and I never lost a debate that badly. Because what she said is that I claim that only a religious Orthodox Jew is truly Jewish. Which obviously I did not claim, and it was enough to look around to realize this is not true. What I did say is that for people who are raised outside of Jewishness, this is the most direct way of rejoining. But very clearly, it was not convincing enough to what was left of the Jewish street. And I wasn't exactly booed out of the room only because an old lady stood up and said that she knew my mother and she's sure I meant well. But since the entire driving force that had been present there at the time of the transformation went to shul, that's where people went with their Jewish problems. And Poland in the early 90s was full of people discovering, or saying for the first time, that they are, well, sort of Jewish. And since the Jewish thing was happening in shul, they started showing up and getting a very unsatisfactory response. Not only because Orthodoxy is not terribly welcoming in its best days, but also because we're so desperately disorganized that we were simply not able to help other people who were showing up even more disorganized than ourselves. And at times, these were dramatic choices. I remember a Polish peasant in his late 50s showing up in shul one day with the following story. His father had passed away 2 days earlier. They were from the region of Grujec, an apple-growing region near Warsaw. And on his deathbed, his father had told him, "Staś, you know that of all our children, it is you whom we love most. But you have to understand that you will not inherit the land. Because what you do not know is that you're not our blood. You're a Jewish orphan from the ghetto that we saved. And we love you, but you understand that a Jew cannot inherit the land." And Staś, who had lived all his life as a Polish peasant, Catholic, vaguely anti-Semitic, suddenly discovers he's Jewish and shows up at shul and says, "So what am I supposed to do with the rest of my life? I mean, do I get circumcised? Do I emigrate to Israel? What?" And the best we could tell him is, "Well, we don't know either, and probably the best thing for you is to try to pick up your life where you left it." This was an extremely dramatic example, but in retrospect, I think we were very unhelpful to a lot of people who were trying to find their way to an acceptable Jewishness. And we were unhelpful because we were, well, still very unsure of ourselves. There was a dramatic vote in the Warsaw Jewish community about conditions of membership, late 90s. Initially, it was very simple. It's halakhic Jewishness, end of story. And then some young people moved that we should also accept non-halakhic Jews as members. They might not be accepted into the minyan, fine, but they should be accepted in the community as members. And practically everybody agreed with that. We passed it, and then I suggested that if this is the case, we should also make the possibility to accept people who have no Jewish origin, but a proven commitment to the Jewish people and no other religious appurtenance. And frankly, I was thinking of half a dozen non-Jewish wives of Jewish men who had done more for the Jewish people than all of those men combined. And this was met with a very strong no from the same people who advocated for the admission of non-halakhic Jews. Because, well, yesh gvul, right? We need to set a border somewhere. And because we are all still fresh at it, the border needs to be thick and visible, so there. And this has remained the case to this very day. I mean, from a halakhic perspective, a non-halakhic Jew and a non-Jewish Jew, there's no difference. The only reason why we could stick to the first half of the change, that is, accept non-halakhic Jews and not accept people who have no Jewish origins, is frankly racism. There's no other explanation for it. But we stuck to it because young identities are easily scared and need thick boundaries. I hope for a revote, but that might still take some time. But for the first 10 years or so of the re-something of Polish Jews after '89, the Orthodox shul was the place where it was happening. This puzzled a good number of Poles of Jewish origin. I remember a sweet old lady, a friend of my mother's, telling me, well, look, I mean, yes, I understand Jews, it's all very nice. But frankly, if you have to go religious, and that was really the disappointment. I mean, mother gave me a good education, and I ended up like this. If you have to go religious, well, look at the Catholics. I mean, they have all this great religious culture. I mean, it's enough to read the Psalms, and what do we have? This was the level of unknowing of your own heritage and your own tradition, which was the norm. And frankly, we were not that much advanced. We started on the route earlier. We had possibly a stronger motivation. But we learned our Yiddishkeit after we accepted it. Which, of course, harkens back to a well-known comment that we made at Sinai, right? We shall do and we shall hear. Na'am and Nishma, right? We accepted what we're supposed to be before we knew what we're supposed to be. And it worked. Now, we continued believing that since the shul is where it's happening, this is the way it's going to be. And of course, we're proven wrong. First of all, other shuls start popping up. Less orthodox, probably non-orthodox, liberal, occasionally conservative, whatever. And we immediately had a Milchama Yehudi about who is Jewish and who has a right to claim the title. And both the challengers and us, the defenders, acted rather horribly. And the dispute, in a way, is still continuing. The real problem was that it didn't matter terribly to most Poles of Jewish origin. While we took our sweet time to sort ourselves out, get our act together, and finally decide what our identities are, people who had been confronted with their Jewishness, well, couldn't wait for years until we get our act together, and sorted themselves out on their own, usually reintegrating their Polish identities with a little strand of Yiddishkeit attached. The fact that a substantial chunk of Polish civil society was very welcoming of this kind of diversity helped a lot. In the early 90s, discovering that grandma was Jewish was a bombshell, it was an earthquake. It was the sky in flames, as a Polish novel was famously titled. By today, it's a biographical curiosity, at least in the big cities. It's no big deal. It's yet, probably if your mother had a love affair, it would be more significant than if you discovered that she was Jewish. So people no longer felt the obligation to become Jewish in an identified way, card-carrying Jewish, right? And we, being the Orthodox community, we lost what we had at the beginning. That is that we no longer are the get-to address if you want to do something Jewish. And actually, most of the stuff that's happening in a Jewishly interesting way today is simply not connected to the community. It's either individuals who are Jewish and then something else. Jewish and LGBT, Jewish and politically active, Jewish and this, Jewish and that. Who are, well, zwischen, right? In between. And the in-betweenness is the thing that's creative. We have a number of very creative people who are Jewish. They're simply not active in the community. And they're not active in the community because we're not terribly interested. We're not terribly interesting because of the demography of it. All card-carrying Jews in Poland, all orientations combined, religious, secular, veterans of World War II, high school students, the works, some 8,000. There are more Buddhists, card-carrying Buddhists in Poland than Jews. If you add to them those whom I call the Groucho Marxists, remember Groucho Marx was too proud to belong to a club that would have him? Okay, well, we've got our Groucho Marxists who identify but don't affiliate, That's hopefully another 15,000 or so. Okay, so we beat the Buddhists, we no longer beat the Muslims. And then there is the unknown and unknowable number of people who still believe it's safer to be Jewish in private only, or even don't know they're Jewish because their parents or grandparents have done such a good job at concealing their identities. And this, of course, is unknowable, but by the same token, irrelevant. However, even if the small community is too small to be creative, its very persistence and its attractiveness to its members shows something that I would be very surprised to learn when I started discovering about my own Jewishness, is it's fun to be Jewish. It's actually interesting. It grows on you and it feeds you. And there's no other way of finding out than doing it. And you have to do it on trust, because frankly, the beginnings are not fun at all. This is why I think that this story is relevant not only to this remnant of Polish Jews, it's Jewishly relevant in general because we have proven, at least ourselves, that the choices that we made 40 years ago, 30 years ago, were more than worth it. We live lives that are clearly better lives to us than the lives we had led without this factor of Yiddishkeit being introduced. And this probably is significant not only to Poland at the turn of the century, this probably is one of the things that's kept us going for the last 35 centuries or so. And the weird part of it is that unless you do it, you really don't know. And there is no way you can convince anybody that the investment is worthwhile unless that person meets Jews who are actually glad to be Jewish. Problems there, however. First of all, while 40 years ago, 30 years ago, we were stuck between anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism, since then we have at least two more factors we need to try to deal with. One is our relationship to Israel. And that's always been complicated. There is a gut-level identification and solidarity. And there's growing discomfort. From a Polish perspective, the first thing that turned us off when we would go to Israel was the amount of national flags per square meter. It felt like the capital of Togo on the second anniversary of independence. It felt like everything we didn't like back at home, okay? The flags, the uniforms, the nationalism. A friend of mine made Aliyah in the 80s, and he was too old to do his military service, but he still had to do miluim, and they would send one patrol duty to check Arabs' IDs. And they asked him, how do you tell Arabs apart? I mean, okay, if they're in Galadia or something, I understand, but if they're in European garb, how do you tell them from Jews? Oh, that's easy, he says. By their sad Jewish eyes, I can identify them. And this is, it's not only our problem with Israel, and it's also part of Israel's problem with Israel. But we are, for many years, Israel was a driving force of Jewish identity. And today we're not sure of it anymore. Israel is certainly a driving force of something. It's simply no longer obvious to us that we want to go in the direction that the driving force is going. And the other, much more important problem is Holocaust identity. I don't use the word Holocaust, I say Shoah, but in the term Holocaust identity, it's the word Holocaust that is appropriate. The idea that you should be Jewish, because had you been Jewish, then they would have murdered you. What a great reason to be Jewish. It's behind the Holocaust tourism from Israel, from the diaspora, that we witness every year, which today no longer ignores us, but considers us irrelevant. I mean, Poland is important because that's where Auschwitz is, in Treblinka, and the site of the Warsaw Ghetto, and Majdanek. Oh, and a few ancillary Jews on the side. When it started, when the March of the Living started, Polish Jews were banned from participating. It was not until 1994, or 95, sorry, that Polish Jews were allowed to participate in the March of the Living, and that was only because non-Jewish Poles were accepted, and they decided they can't really be anti-Semitic and refuse to accept Jews if they accept Catholics. But until then, our presence was unwelcome because we spoiled the narrative. If we were there, well, if we were there because we were too fearful to move anywhere else, fine. But if we're there because that's where home is, at home is where people, most of the people whom we love are. That didn't rhyme well with the idea that Galut is destruction and the Shoah is the ultimate consequence of Galut and Israel is the only answer. Today the message tends to be somewhat subtler, but the bottom line remains the same. So now we have to try to carve out the Jewish identity, not only against two non-Jewish factors, philo and anti-Semitism, but also against two Jewish factors, Israeli identification and the civil religion of the Shoah. And that becomes slightly too complicated for many who think something of Jewishness is simply too difficult, too contradictory to engage in. Okay, I think they're wrong, and I think that the answer remains the same, that it's such an extraordinary adventure that it's worthwhile embarking on it, even if we discover that we're not as smart as we thought we are. We actually have done a good job of disproving at least that one anti-Semitic myth, that Jews are smart. We're not necessarily at any rate. But we've got 3,500 years of arguing with text, arguing with Jews, trying to discover what the story is, and yes, having fun on the way. That worked for us in the rather unpleasant circumstances of Poland, late communism. If it worked there, it probably can work elsewhere. This is the interest of the story. But the other aspect of it, and with this I'll conclude, is that yes, numbers matter. A community of 8,000 cannot be creative. In a community of 8,000, all conflicts immediately become personal. In a community of 8,000, the same half-dozen people can aspire for leadership because nobody else wants it. And if we don't break out of this, we're doomed to remain this kind of uninteresting community for the foreseeable future. And I had actually thought that there is a way out. As Poland was progressing, I thought that eventually we'd be able to divert a part of the stream that is still continuing of Jewish emigration from the FSU to Germany and other places westwards. Divert them to Poland. Okay, not many. I'd be happy to have 10,000, okay? With 10,000, we'd already break the mold. And it didn't seem to be a ridiculous dream. Poland was becoming richer and safer. Okay, still not as rich and as safe as, say, Germany. On the other hand, rich enough and safe enough for the fact that it's closer to home, and actually it was home before Russia became home, for that to become a factor. It started happening. It could have happened. Okay, we screwed it up. We being Poland. I wouldn't be seriously convincing people that they should emigrate to Poland if they're Jewish right now. And this might last for a while. The atmosphere is nasty and it's not visibly going to improve. Which means that we're stuck with ourselves. But, in fact, this is where we've always been. And if being stuck with ourselves was not interesting enough, creative enough, fun enough, we wouldn't be here. I mean, we wouldn't be here either, right? So there's a value to it, and I'll leave you with that.
Thank you, Konstanty. Now we have about 10 minutes for questions and comments from the public. So once again, please say your name, affiliation, and proceed with questions.